Well, Madam President, I rise to address two issues this afternoon. The first is Amendment 1190, and I'll be quick as I can on this because I want to spend more time dealing with the Johnson Amendment, which I also will address. So Amendment 1190 really arises because of the very unusual procedural circumstances we find ourselves in. Madam President, as you probably know very well, for technical procedural reasons, the Senate has chosen to conduct the debate about the Corker-Cardin bill, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, on a House legislative vehicle that was sent over to us. But in order to do this, all of the language from the House bill gets stripped out and it goes away. That original House bill, it's H.R. 1191, it was Protecting Volunteer Firefighters and Emergency Responders Act. I want to talk a little bit about it, but here's my amendment. It's pretty simple. I just want to restore the language from that House-passed vehicle. It's pretty simple. I don't think it's controversial. Let me just sum up what this is about. This is a bill that was authored in the House by Congressman Lou Barletta from Pennsylvania, and it's just a bill that would protect volunteer firefighters from some unintended consequences of Obamacare. More specifically, it exempts volunteer firefighters from counting towards the trigger for the employer mandate. I don't think it was ever intended that volunteer firefighters would be counted this way, but nevertheless, the danger arises because of an IRS ruling. So the IRS issued a guidance back in 2013 that suggested that volunteer firefighters would have to count any benefits they got as income. It gave rise to the question of whether they would be counted towards the Obamacare limit. They've gone back and forth. They have issued a ruling that says that volunteer firefighters would not be counted to triggering the number of employees that invokes Obamacare. But that is just an administrative ruling at this point. It could change at any point in time. And if it were to change, and if every volunteer fire department in America that had 50 or more volunteer firefighters had to be deemed to be an employer requiring a full Obamacare coverage, I dare say it would put out of business virtually every volunteer fire department in America, because none of these volunteer fire departments have the kind of money it would take to go out and buy health care for these volunteer firefighters, nor was Obamacare ever intended to cover these folks. This would be a huge problem, in particular in Pennsylvania, where we have 2,400 volunteer fire departments, more than any other state in the union. And we have over 50,000 volunteers in Pennsylvania alone, but there's over 750,000 nationally. So, as I said, the IRS did give us a ruling that, for now, they won't deem volunteer firefighters to be employees for the purpose of triggering Obamacare mandates. But I would like, and I'm not the only one who would like to have this codified in law so that this danger goes away and that volunteer fire departments can continue to thrive. This passed the House unanimously. There's bipartisan support here in the Senate. I want to thank the chairman of the committee and the ranking member. My understanding is that there's no opposition from either of them to this amendment, which is very straightforward, and I'd be delighted with a voice vote when the time is appropriate for that. I'd be very grateful. And I've said my piece about the volunteer firefighters, but I do think it's a great opportunity to just get this taken care of. What I'd like to address, though, is the incredibly important debate that we're having now about the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. And let me state very clearly, I think the underlying bill that Senators Corker and Cardin have produced is a very important good faith effort to give Congress some say in something that Congress absolutely should have a say in. But I do think there's an underlying problem with the bill. And the underlying problem with the bill is that the reality is, at the end of the day, an agreement announced by the president with Iran, should that come to pass, it could be opposed by a majority of senators. It could be opposed by a big majority of senators, and it would still go into effect, despite the provisions in this underlying bill. And specifically why I say that is, in the first place, in order to prevent the congressionally authorize sanctions from being waived, we need to pass a resolution of disapproval, and that takes 60 votes in the Senate. So any 41 senators could prevent that from taking place, and then the deal goes forward, the sanctions get lifted. If we have a supermajority, more than 60, and we could pass this legislation and send it to the president, he could veto it, and then it would take 67 votes to override the president's veto. So the math is pretty clear. Any 34 senators in support of the agreement could permit the agreement to go ahead, while 66 senators could oppose the agreement, and yet it would take place. It seems to me, Madam President, that this turns an important part of the Constitution on its head, and that is Article 2, Section 2, that says the President shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators concur. So, in my view, this certainly ought to be deemed to be a treaty because it rises to that level of importance. A treaty is generally defined as an agreement through negotiation signed by nations. I think that's what we're talking about here. Certainly something of this enormous importance as arguably the most dangerous regime in the world, on a path that might very well enable them to obtain the most dangerous weapon in the world. It's hard to imagine things that are much more important than that. So I think it certainly ought to rise to the level of a treaty. We routinely treat matters of much lesser import as treaties, and this is not just a sort of an abstract theoretical question of presidential authority. There are very specific, very real consequences. It is my view that we're on a path toward a very bad, a very dangerous deal. And the only way I can think of that we change the path that we're on is if there is a plausible, credible possibility for Congress to stop this, which would then cause these negotiations to change their course, which is what I think has to happen to avoid a very dangerous outcome. Let me be clear, my goal is not to kill any deal. My goal is to get a good deal, one that provides for the security and safety that our country needs, and I don't think that's the direction we're on right now. Let me explain a few of the reasons why. I guess the simple summary was very aptly put by the Prime Minister of Israel when he spoke to a joint session of Congress, and he said the problem with this deal is that it would not block Iran's path to a bomb. It paves the path. And that's exactly what I'm concerned about ultimately. Let me explain why I'm concerned about that. I'd say three big categories of reasons. First, the administration has already made too many concessions. Second, the Iranian regime is a regime we cannot trust. And third, while the administration says, don't worry, you don't need to trust them because we can verify and enforce this agreement, and boy, if they step out of line, we will snap those sanctions back in a heartbeat. Madam President, that's a fantasy, and I don't see that working. Let me explain these three categories. With respect to the concessions, first of all, we ought to be concerned, I think, about the concessions that were made before the negotiations even began. The concessions that we wouldn't even address the ongoing ballistic missile program that the Iranians continue to pursue and make ever more sophisticated. We wouldn't address their active, ongoing support for terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East and around the world. That wouldn't be on the table. We wouldn't address their open declarations that they want to wipe Israel off the planet, off the planet Earth. These things were permitted to just be set aside. That's a pretty major round of concessions before we ever got to the table. My next concern are the way the administration has been moving the goalposts throughout these discussions. So the initial goal was stated by the president in the fall of 2013. He said the goal is to ensure that Iran would not have a nuclear bomb. That was the right goal. The only problem is that's not the goal anymore. Now the goal is, according to the administration, that we'd have about 12 months' notice if the Iranians decide to develop and deploy nuclear weapons. That's a huge, huge concession, and I think a very, very dangerous one. And finally, maybe the most disturbing concession is, it seems to me that the framework of this deal, as it's been described by the administration, allows Iran to retain a nuclear infrastructure. actually an industrial-scale nuclear infrastructure. The underground facility at Fordo, plutonium reactor at Arak, thousands of centrifuges for a country that doesn't need a single centrifuge if their intended purpose really is just to have peaceful nuclear energy. They don't need a single centrifuge. They can buy enriched uranium. They don't need to have the domestic capability of enriching it with centrifuges, but it's already been conceded that they'll have thousands. None of this, by the way, is going to be destroyed. Anything that's deactivated gets locked away, but it's still there. And frankly, I'm worried about the next round of concessions. If you listen to, as I have, to the way the administration has described the framework of this agreement, and then you listen to how the Iranians have described it, there are some huge divergencies here. For instance, with respect to the sanctions, the administration has said that the sanctions would be lifted gradually only as and when the Iranians comply with the terms of the agreement. The Iranians have said absolutely not. The sanctions get lifted immediately upon execution of the agreement. And with inspections, this essential part of the enforcement mechanism, the administration has said we'll have the ability to inspect anytime, anywhere. The Iranians have said, no, you won't. You'll only do inspections by permission, and military sites are off limits altogether. Madam President, I think this is a very disturbing range of concessions that have already been made, and the deal's not finished yet. The second point I make is that we can't trust this regime. I just think that's abundantly obvious. I think it's pretty clear they have not reached a decision as a nation that they want to abandon their quest for a nuclear weapon. I don't think they have. And you look at their behavior. They've been killing Americans since 1979, including nearly 1,500 U.S. soldiers in Iraq from the sophisticated IEDs that they made. Iran is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. They're promoting radical Islam in many places in the Middle East. They recently were plotting to assassinate the Saudi ambassador by a bomb planted in a D.C. restaurant. They've repeatedly declared their intention to wipe Israel off the map, and they have a history of cheating on agreements and violating UN resolutions. Why do we think this time would be different? Well, as I said, the administration says, don't worry, you don't have to trust. We'll have verification and enforcement and snapback sanctions. Well, Madam President, I don't think that's realistic at all, but it's not just my view. Henry Kissinger and George Shultz wrote, I thought, a very important essay about this. And they mentioned, among other things, the difficulty we're going to probably have in even discovering that the cheating is going on. And I quote from the Kissinger-Shultz article, they say, in a large country with multiple facilities and ample experience in nuclear concealment, violations will be inherently difficult to detect. And not only that, it looks like we're, in a way, subbing out the enforcement to the UN. Populated, I might remind my colleagues, by countries that are often not terribly friendly to the United States. And there we will have the challenge of proving violations that we do discover, proving that they are in fact violations. Again, Kissinger and Shultz point out, when cheating for a breakout occurs, it is unlikely to be a clear-cut event. Rather, it is likely to be the gradual accumulation of ambiguous evasions. So we discover these ambiguous evasions, and what do? We've got to go to the UN, convince them that I suspect the Iranians will deny them. And how long will this process go on while this is adjudicated, and while the Iranians remain in violation? And what are our chances that we'll eventually convince the people we need to convince at the UN that we're right and they're wrong? But even if we're successful in all this, the administration says, well, that's when we'll just snap the sanctions right back in place. How could that even be a serious notion when the sanctions regime is crumbling right now? I mean, it's already crumbling. I mean, the Russians are selling air defense systems now to the Iranians. And why is the president so reluctant to have Congress have a role in this in any case? If the president can make the case that America will be more secure as a result of this agreement, he should be able to convince the American public and the United States Senate and get the votes, and then he would have a much more enduring agreement. A treaty is binding indefinitely, and it would have the approval of Congress. It wouldn't have the temporary nature of the executive agreement. So, Madam President, I think it's a responsibility that we have to uphold the Constitution. It's a responsibility we have to maximize the safety of the American people to the extent we can. And so I hope my colleagues will support the Johnson Amendment, which will simply deem this agreement to be a treaty and require the 2/3 vote of ratification that a treaty requires. Thank you, Madam President.